Please welcome my good friend and the next Prime Minister of Canada, Tom Mulcair.
Thank you. Thank you, Ken. Merci beaucoup. I'd like to thank you, and I'd like to thank Steelworkers International President Léo Gérard for your friendship and your partnership with the New Democratic Party. Merci, Léo, d'avoir toujours été là avec nous. Together, New Democrats and Steel have been leading the fight to strengthen and protect collective bargaining rights on the picket lines, in the workplace, and in government. For over 5 decades, that's been our job together. And together, we will be a voice for working women and men for decades to come. I'd especially like to thank all the MGM staff who have helped make this event possible. Let's hear it for the Culinary United Here Local 226. And what I am told is the busiest union in Las Vegas, the Bartenders Union, Unite Here Local 165. It's great to be here in a union town in the United States of America. In fact, Las Vegas is the United States' most unionized city. Friends, today our movement faces a turning point in its history. Throughout the last century, progressive organizations in North America and around the world worked in solidarity to help drive the greatest reduction of inequality in human history. We changed the way people work and the way they live. You know, tiny things like having the weekend off and providing for workplace safety, jobs with a salary that was enough for a family to live on, and a pension you could retire on. And all this while fostering the largest economic expansion that the world has ever known. But today, those gains are under attack. Today, workers are no longer seen as the engines of our economy, as the women and men who drive growth and bring innovation to life. Organized labor is portrayed as an impediment to profits, an evil that has to be overcome, beaten down. In Canada, the current Conservative government makes no effort whatsoever to mask its contempt for workers and their rights. Open hostility is, in fact, a source of pride amongst neoconservatives and neoliberals alike. Their hostility manifests itself in outright attacks on benefits and services that Canadian families have relied on for generations, slashing funding for free, universal public medical care, raising the retirement age from 65 to 67. Je sais pas pour vous autres, mais moi, j'ai aucun souvenir que Stephen Harper a annoncé lors de la dernière campagne qu'il allait changer l'âge de la retraite de 65 à 67. Et pourtant, il l'a fait. Telling unemployed Canadians that if they don't take a 30% pay cut, they'll lose the unemployment insurance benefits that they've paid into all their lives. And this after Liberal and Conservative governments together stole $57 billion of workers' money from the Employment Insurance Fund. We see this same contempt in government interference in contract negotiations and back-to-work laws that chip away at collective bargaining rights. We see it in government decisions to rubber stamp foreign takeovers, even when those same takeovers cost hundreds or thousands of Canadians their jobs, like the hundreds of steel workers laid off at the Valley Inco mines in Ontario and Manitoba, or like the workers locked out at Rio Tinto Elcan in Alma, Quebec, or the Voisey's Bay smelter in Labrador. We face a government in Canada that's not only allowing some of our most profitable companies to exploit cheap labor, it's actually encouraging it over the last 8 years. Under Conservatives, the use of temporary foreign workers in Canada has more than doubled. These are workers who are deprived of their basic right to organize. They're put at the mercy of their employer, afraid to be sent home. And this government, and I'm not exaggerating here, actually had a rule allowing companies to pay these workers 15% less than Canadian workers doing the exact same job. And we fought successfully to get that shameful rule eliminated. We've got a, yes, you're very proud of what we did together. We've got a long way to go in this fight, but we're not going to stop. We're not going to stop until every worker is protected, whether they've been in here a day, a week, a year, or a lifetime. Even as we're fighting these battles, we have to realize that we're facing in Canada and the US is bigger than any one policy or any one government. This is the culmination of a 40-year effort by Conservatives since Reagan and Thatcher to dismantle collective bargaining rights, to lower wages and working conditions, to tell workers that they have to accept less, that our children have to accept less. Here in the United States, we see this effort in the single biggest threat to union membership in America, the so-called right-to-work laws. In Idaho alone, where union-busting legislation was enacted 5 years ago, the number of workers represented and protected by unions has been cut in half. And other key states have followed suit in attacking these fundamental rights. In states with these aggressive anti-union laws, workers are earning on average $1,500 less every year. Right to work indeed, as long as you're willing to work as cheap labor. In those states, workers are less likely to have health insurance, less likely to be protected by basic health and safety rules. Women are no longer guaranteed equal pay for work of equal value. And let me tell you, few things have emboldened anti-labor groups in Canada more than watching laws like these pass just across our southern border in places like Michigan. In Canada, we're calling out this agenda and naming it for what it is: an attack on livelihoods, an attack on working families, an attack on future generations. You know, this is not just a debate about unions or even the right to organize. It's a debate about what sort of society we want to live in. It's been 30 years since Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher told us that if only governments would butt out of the economy, wealth would come trickling down. Well, they've been trickling on workers for 30 years, and inequality has never been greater. Enough is enough. There was a heavy metal concert in Montreal on the weekend, which meant that sitting beside me on the plane was Dee Snider, the lead singer for Twisted Sister, and the author of the song, "We're Not Gonna Take It." He invited me to say that to you at this point in my speech. We're not gonna take it. Or, as you say here in the Southwest, no más. Ou, comme mon ami Léo Gérard et moi on dirait, assez, c'est assez. Somos los Latinos del Norte. Conservatives these days like to argue that maybe unions had their place once, a century ago, when we faced rampant income inequality and unsafe working conditions. But those problems are gone, they like to say. Today, everyone's doing just fine. It's an argument, of course, that's based more on their ideology than on fact. The truth is, today, we face levels of income inequality not seen since the Great Depression. In the past 35 years, income has grown only for the top 20%, which means that everyone else, fully 80% of the population, has actually seen their income go down. Now, if we continue down this path, we will be the first generation in history to leave less to our children than what we inherited from our parents, and I, for one, am going to fight not to be that generation. Around the world, we've watched a whole generation of good middle-class jobs disappear, while governments have done nothing to create the next generation of middle-class jobs. The fact is, the greatest inequality we face today is the growing gap between generations, and that gap is only getting worse. Here in the US, nearly 60% of all job losses during the recession were those of the middle class. Yet since 2010, nearly 60% of the jobs created in the US have been low-wage jobs, not the little middle-class ones that were lost. These are jobs that often pay minimum wage, a salary that keeps workers on the cusp of poverty. Think about that for a moment. We're talking about students who've graduated with tens of thousands of dollars in debt, nearing their 30s and still working at entry-level, low-wage jobs just to pay the interest. We're talking about bookkeepers and administrative assistants, middle-class folks who lost their job in the recession, who are now working 2 jobs at $7.25 an hour just to scrape by. In Canada, regions that have traditionally been prosperous, like Southern Ontario, one of the largest industrial and financial centers of our country, now face unemployment that's higher than the national average. And even when employment numbers go up, the jobs are low-wage, part-time, and contract work. Listen to this statistic. In Toronto alone, Canada's largest city, a staggering 50% of households cannot rely on a single, stable, full-time job. You heard that right. Parents are seeing less and less of each other, working 2, sometimes 3 part-time jobs. Children and families are paying the price. And again, we see that this is bigger than any one government or any one party. In Canada, it was the Liberal Party that eliminated the federal minimum wage in 1996, got rid of it altogether, lowering the bar for governments at all levels. Well, when New Democrats formed government in 2015, we're going to raise the bar, we're going to reinstate the federal minimum wage, and mark my words, it will be a living wage. En 1996, le Parti libéral du Canada a éliminé le salaire minimum fédéral, ce qui a entraîné un nivellement vers le bas pour tous les paliers gouvernementaux. Eh bien, lorsque nous formerons le gouvernement en 2015, nous allons niveler vers le haut. Nous allons rétablir le salaire minimum fédéral et croyez-moi, il s'agit d'un salaire suffisant pour qu'une famille vive correctement. At the same time that these same governments are undermining wage and labor standards, they're dismantling basic health, safety, and environmental protections. Oil spills, beef recalls, train derailments. Communities and individuals are being put at risk. And what do these things have in common? Well, governments are no longer upholding their most basic responsibility, to protect the public. Last year, in my home province, 47 people on a lovely July evening were in a terraced area having a drink, and 47 people were vaporized when a train filled with highly volatile crude oil derailed and exploded. While the courts have yet to deal with this case, it's worth noting that the only people who have been charged so far have been workers, not the company, not the owners. It was the United Steelworkers who fought for a decade after the Westray mine disaster in Nova Scotia to pass legislation holding companies criminally responsible for creating dangerous working conditions. Yet, in the decades since that legislation was finally passed, not a single company has ever been charged. As the USW has called for and demanded, it is time to enforce the law. Now, this so-called deregulation was in fact just the rollback of basic health and safety protections, and yet they were sold to the public on the premise that they would somehow pave our path to prosperity. But in the greatest irony of all, it was exactly this sort of unfettered deregulation that led to the greatest global economic crisis since the Great Depression. In Canada, it was only the NDP that held the anchor tight against deregulation. Only the NDP that fought to protect the integrity of our financial sector. And today, Canadians are thankful that we did. Now, this is interesting because Liberals and Conservatives who wanted to deregulate now like to brag about Canada's stable banking system. In fact, they're trying to take credit for ignoring their own advice. And all the while, these same governments dole out tax cuts by the billions to the largest, most profitable companies. Today, the only ones in our society not paying their fair share are corporations. They benefit most from our institutions, police, the courts, infrastructure, education. These are the institutions that helped them get rich in the first place. But now, they want to stick someone else with the bill. C'est un peu comme le beau-frère que vous invitez au resto et il réussit toujours à se pousser avant que la facture arrive. Where governments once took a leadership role in protecting the public interest, now they protect only private interests. And in so doing, they've sacrificed our long-term prosperity for their short-term political gain. Now, of course, the private sector will always be the key to our economy and central to our economic growth. But that has to be an economy built on a strong and healthy workforce, on balanced and sustainable growth, and on broad-based prosperity. An economy that works not just for some of us, but for each and every one of us, an economy where no one is left behind. I'm here to tell you there's hope. 10 years ago, the New Democratic Party held a grand total of 13 seats in the Canadian House of Commons. That's 13 seats out of 308 at the time. In the last election, our party won over 100. Here in the United States, just last week, there was a landmark case at the National Labor Relations Board that McDonald's could no longer hide behind franchise owners when sued for violating labor standards. Just so you know, in Canada, McDonald's was one of the worst offenders, treating temporary foreign workers like indentured servants. This is a company that just a year ago was telling workers who had been demanding a higher wage that, in fact, the real problem was that they just had to learn how to manage their household budget. Now, this is the best part. They may be about to become the first major North American fast food company to bring in a union. Why? Well, the irony is, McDonald's may now need a collective agreement as much as their workers to protect themselves from hundreds of lawsuits. Well, better late than never. Friends, we live in an age of unparalleled innovation. We have greater human potential than ever before, and a greater ability to put that potential to work. What confronts us today isn't a failure of ability, but a lack of political will. Leaders with no vision and no ideas tell us that we have to settle for less. But we know that together we can strive for more. Every hope of every one of us who longs for a better future for their children and their grandchildren, everyone who's ever dreamt of fairness and equality, has brought us to this day. I know the United Steelworker doesn't just talk about these goals, it's willing to fight for them on both sides of the border, and we'll continue that fight together because workers deserve better. Together, we'll make that dream a reality. We'll build a better world, not just for today, but for generations to come. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Now let's go get it done. On continue.